Hello, and welcome to the program. This is the Black Ponderer, and wait, let me get a sip. Stay hydrated. No, I'm your host, Neil Trotter, and today, we're gonna be talking more about political philosophy in this video. And we're just gonna keep rolling. Last video we talked about anarchism, and we're gonna continue with some more anarchist philosophy. And in this video we're going to be visiting the very well-known living philosopher Noam Chomsky, and we're going to be checking out this collection of essays and interviews from him by him called On Anarchism. So Chomsky, he's got his hardcore fans. He's got his people who are like, he's all right. You got his people. You got the people who are like, meh, he's all right. He's average. In terms of his ideas. And then you got the haters. And I met, all different people who hold all these different opinions, from hardcore fans to like haters and everywhere in between, right? I met anarchists who say, "Oh, Chomsky's not a real anarchist. He capitulates too much with neoliberals." Right? You got that, and then you got people on the exact opposite saying, "Oh, that radical leftist. I don't want to even talk about him." It's just all over the place. Now, he's also very famous for his philosophy of language and his study of linguistics, which honestly I'm not really familiar with. Maybe one day I'll read one of his works on that. Again, like some people tell me like, "Whoa, this philosophy of language is awesome." I met those people. And then other people who study language and linguistics very seriously, they say, "Oh, I don't really buy his argument, and his ideas about language and linguistics are kind of like very shallow and such and all this stuff." Chomsky is like all over the place. I will say that I really like this book. For the most part, I really liked it, and I just want to share with you some insights that I've had reading it. It's on anarchism, so it was a great work that showed me more and more about, okay, what the hell is anarchism, right? What is it as a philosophy? Because he's really into anarchism, and he breaks it down very well in several of these essays and interviews that are collected in this work. So we're gonna dive into that. So what we do here at the Black Ponderer, in case you're new, maybe this is your very first video, we actually read the text. That's right, we read quotes from the text. That's what we do. And then we add some supplementary commentary through me in the videos. But also, you feel free to commentate online via the YouTube comment section. And we just keep rolling with the discussion. So that's what we're going to do. And in case you're following along, just happen to have a copy of this book and want to read along, I'm going to read you just some quotes here. This is just page 1, and this is the 5th line. "There have been many styles of thought and action that have been referred to as anarchist. It would be hopeless to try to encompass all of these conflicting tendencies in some general theory or ideology. And even if we proceed to extract from the history of libertarian thought a living, evolving tradition, it remains difficult to formulate its doctrines as a specific and determinate theory of society and social change." Okay, so that's the thing with anarchism. With anarchism, there is no definitive, this is the way that we're going to do anarchism, right? There are some basic principles and some general concepts. Actually, there's some pretty specific concepts, which we will go into, but there is no specific detailed outline like a lot of other political philosophies, right? And that's why people, there are many things people have a hard time wrapping their minds around anarchism, and some people just flat out misconceptualize, misconstrue anarchism, don't really understand it. And you might say to yourself, well, maybe that's a problem. There needs to be a definitive outline, a way of doing this, right? Anarchism, a way of politically organizing a society. But anarchism argues that you can't really do that. right? And doing that is a problem, right? And we're going to talk about that. So this is page 2, next page, and again, 5th line on that page. For the anarchists, freedom is not an abstract philosophical concept, but the vital concrete possibility for every human being to bring to full development all the powers, capacities, and talents with which nature has endowed him and turn them to social account. Okay, so, this is why in anarchism, there's no specific single way of doing it, because it's taking into consideration all of human beings' powers, capacities, talents, which is extremely diverse, right? And just very all over the place, right? And so to try and shoehorn that into one method of doing things is impossible. This is page 3, the second to last line of paragraph 2. To reconstruct the economic life of the peoples from the ground up and build it up in the spirit of socialism. Right? So that's the thing. With anarchism, socialism is part of that. It's part of that. Anarchism by default is anti-capitalist. Now, there are branches of anarchism, that accept capitalism, like anarcho-capitalists, right? Which is, a thing. I've actually met real life people who call themselves that. But, Chomsky and like other anarchists would argue, well, that's a contradiction, not in the, and a contradiction not in the Hegelian way, like a contradiction in the non-productive way. Whereas you can't really do anarchism without embracing socialism. How so? Well, we're just gonna keep rolling with some quotes to explain that further. Okay, this is page 10. This is the end of the 4th line. Every anarchist is a socialist, but not every socialist is necessarily an anarchist. Each member must be, to begin with, a socialist. A consistent anarchist must oppose private ownership of the means of production and the wage slavery, which is a component of this system, as incomplete with the principle that labor must be freely undertaken and under the control of the producer. So anarchism shares in common with socialism the idea that it opposes the private ownership of the means of production, right? Which that's what capitalism is, the private ownership of the means of production. If you want to get all Marxist on us here, which that's where we're going here. And then we talk about wage slavery, which we'll get more in depth with that as we read more quotes, which is the idea that you are giving up your means of production to like somebody who owns it. You're letting somebody own your means of production, which creates like a hierarchical relationship that's exploitative, right? Because you're working and your work, your labor, is owned by somebody else. So they have power over you in that way. And that's why anarchism opposes that, because anarchism opposes like a hierarchical power. And when somebody else owns your labor power, they have an authority over you that, is illegitimate, is what is being argued here. This is why, by default, Chomsky and other anarchists argue, of course we're socialists, because, that kind of illegitimate hierarchy, that exploitative relationship between the worker and the person who owns the production of work, the capitalist, that needs to go away. Okay, this is page 13. This is the last paragraph. The consistent anarchist should be a socialist, but a socialist of a particular sort. He will not only oppose alienated and specialized labor and look forward to the appropriation of capital by the whole body of workers, but he will also insist that this appropriation be direct, not exercised by some elite force acting in the name of the proletariat. He will, in short, oppose the organization of production by the government. So that goes into how anarchism is a socialism that detaches itself or kind of separates itself from other ideas of socialism, like Marxist-Leninism, where in Marxist-Leninism, your work is now in the service of an authority. In Marxist-Leninism, for example, the theory is that your work is dedicated to the proletariat or the working class, but oftentimes, in practice throughout history, when countries or nations that adopt Marxist-Leninist political structures, what happens is that the labor of the worker is really owned by the vanguard, or the vanguard, the people who are in charge, the people who have authority, are the ones that are really in ownership of the labor. Right? And so in that way, anarchism really is about like, look, you are the one that owns your labor, and the result of it, right, is you're not working for some idea or some ideology or like a vanguard, or if we return to capitalism, like a corporation of some kind, or a company, or even the government, right? You do labor for you. So let's get more deeper into that notion, right? This idea of, anarchism in relation to labor and work, because that's often not considered, right, when you think of anarchism. But Chomsky is really talking about that and trying to make that connection. So this is page 21, and this is the end of the first sentence of the third paragraph. Wage slavery. I do not think that people ought to be forced to rent themselves in order to survive, right? What does that mean? It's like, well, you got to pay rent. You bring up rent. You got to pay for your living expenses. You have to pay for food. You have to pay for clean water and all these other kinds of necessities for survival, right? So you have to work for a company, right? You literally have to go to a company who you might not even care about. You don't really care about the results of the company or what the company is doing. You just need that paycheck because you got to make ends meet. And Chomsky is like, I think that's really a lousy position for a human to be in, right? But when you think about it, tracks. So of course the counter argument is like, well, that's just how the world works. That's just how it is. But Chomsky is saying well, I mean, why do we accept that? Maybe we could be better. But let's continue. This is the top of page 22. And I think that through various forms of free association and federalism, it's possible to imagine a society working like that. I mean, I don't think you can lay it out in detail. Nobody's smart enough to design a society. You've got to experiment. But reasonable principles on which to build such a society are quite clear. And so now we return to okay, Chomsky, how would you organize that? And Chomsky's like, well, we need to experiment. We have to allow ourselves room to implement certain options, right? Currently, we just completely reject any alternative way of organizing social economics, right? Currently it's well, you have to rent yourself out to survive. It's well, instead of doing that, maybe we could just let necessities just be free, right? Maybe you don't have to rent yourself out to survive. Maybe that's an option we could do. Some people would argue oh, well, actually, we've done that before. Look at socialist countries. Look at, communist countries countries in Central America and South America and such, and, the USSR. But of course, you look at those countries and that really wasn't happening, right? That didn't really occur. It might have occurred for a limited time, and when it did occur, it was controlled by a vanguard or some sort of government authoritarian regime, and there wasn't really a true allocation of free resources for survival, right? Other people will argue well, actually, the USSR, there was a lot of good that happened. A lot of people enjoyed that, or Cuba was a great place to live at a certain point. And it's and I think that's also the other side of the coin is well, that's a very rosy, rose-colored glasses or type of look at what was going on. Maybe some people was enjoying themselves, but then there were definitely other people who were literally starving to death and that kind of thing. So, and then you have to really study and look at these situations and be well, what was really going on, right? Was it truly like people owning their own labor, or were they like just working for another authoritarian regime of some kind, right? And like, were they really in control of their resources, or was ultimately somebody else in power controlling those resources? Chomsky argues like, if you really look at society at large, contemporary examples, you're not really seeing like true socialism going on. And here, like, Chomsky breaks that down. This is page 24. This is the 8th line. The question is, who has the power to ultimately authorize those decisions? Decisions of who really controls the labor of the worker, or like who really controls access to fundamental resources of survival, like housing, healthcare, education, even water resources, food. Like, who's really in control? Well, if it's a democracy, that power ought to lie not just formally in the population, but actually in the population. Meaning the representatives can be recalled, they're answerable back to their community, they can be replaced. In fact, there should be as much as possible in the way of constant replacement, so that political participation just becomes a part of everybody's life. So Chomsky's arguing like, okay, like we live in a democracy, right? But is it an actual true democracy, right? Do people really have control over themselves politically? Or are, we have these representatives, but are they actually doing things in our favor, or are they doing things in the favor of themselves? Have they created their own class of like political elites, and they're just really making decisions that help them and not the general populace? That's really what the United States of America is currently. Is it truly a democracy? I would argue no. One of the reasons is because, the general populace isn't engaged political, like everybody is not engaged politically. And, that's not entirely the fault of the general populace. The way our system is designed, like, it discourages people from being politically active. And that has a lot to do with the fact of the economic system, how like people have to work so much to just have basic necessities for survival, right? That it's hard to engage politically and control their power. Meanwhile, the people who have the power don't have to like work as hard for those kinds of necessities, so they got the time to kind of manage what really goes on in terms of these kinds of decisions. Are they making decisions that help the interests of their constituents, right? Or are these decisions really just benefiting them, right? These are the questions that are raised that pretty much have obvious answers if you just look at society today. But Chomsky continues, but I agree. I don't think it's possible to have large masses of people get together to decide every topic. It would be unfeasible and pointless. You're going to want to pick committees to look into things and report back, and so on and so forth. But the real question is, where does authority lie, right? So, the common concern of, anarchism isn't going to work with so many people. Like, how do you see anarchism work at a global scale? And Chomsky is like, obviously you're going to have some sort of committee system, and you're going to have some sort of representative democracy of some kind. But, and this is where, like, certain anarchists detach themselves from Chomsky. It's like, oh, okay, you're saying all that. Well, that's not how anarchism works. But, Chomsky is being real in the fact that, at a certain point, with so many people and so many interests, and so many variations of demands on needs, you will have to allocate some of that decision-making process where political power goes and where it gets allocated to like dedicated people. But he's saying the important thing to think about is like, where is the authority? Like, if somebody you dedicate to making those decisions is not making decisions in the interests of the public, does the public have true power to like get rid of that person and be like, okay, you're obviously not working in our favor, so we need you to go, right? Is the public truly empowered to do that? That's the question that we have to ask. And like, if not, then we need to create a system where that can happen. And of course, the debate goes back and forth. It's like, oh, well, you know, there's no system so far that's done that. Or like, you know, this is the closest we have to that system, and we should be happy with the system we got. You know, this is the system we have, so we got to work with it. Where Chomsky is like, that's very much lazy thinking, or you're not really putting in enough effort to actually make a true system that appeals to the needs of all people. And I would further say, I think Chomsky would agree that it's not so much lazy thinking as it is intentionally having these pseudo systems of democracy that like trick people into believing they are free when they're really not, or they're kind of a distraction where it's like, oh, you know, we have democracy, so I don't have to worry about that. I can continue to just, you know, work my ass off to just pay rent, right? And Chomsky continues here on page 27. This is literally the middle of the page right here. I'm beginning. You can't really figure out what problems are going to arise in group situations unless you experiment with them. It's like physics. You can't just sit around and think that the world will be like under such and such conditions. You've got to experiment and learn how things actually work out. You can, in fact, construct quite viable and successful democratic structures, but there are still going to be problems that come along. And one of the problems that people just have to face is the effect of group pressures to conform. Chomsky argues like, hey, you know, politics should be like a science. We do have like political science, right? But we sure as hell don't treat it like physics, right? We don't say like, okay, this isn't working, we need to change things up. Like, you know, often happens with like actual science. Although one can, you know, you look at like the state of many scientific institutions today, they're kind of marred also in like authoritarian government structures of a different kind. So are they doing it? But the theory, the actual scientific method should be implemented in politics too. You know, here in America, there's that old reference to the Electoral College where like obviously that's not working in our favor or in the favor of the populace, the general population. It's only in favor of like people who are in power, right? Or certain kinds of people. And that's how it's always been. But a lot of argument is like, well, you know, that's the system we have now, so that's what we just have to deal with. And it's like, well, you know, if you were to apply the scientific method, you wouldn't say that. You would just be like, okay, this is not working. We need to change it up, right? But we need to experiment with something else. And then the counter argument would be like, well, you know, if you change it up, then what do you think is going to happen? You might mess things up further. You know, who knows? You might as well just leave it alone. And it's like, well, you know, science doesn't work like that, right? You know, you do something, it doesn't turn out the way it works, you change up the experiment. And it gets better using logic and reason and like things that have worked, you build upon that. And you know, that's what he's saying, like Chomsky is saying. Like, this is how politics should function. And like anarchism encourages that kind of way of structuring society, whereas our current systems do not. And then this is interesting. This is the next page, 28. This is the end of the fifth line. Socialism is an effort to try to solve man's animal problems. And after having solved the animal problems, then we can face the human problems. But it's not a part of socialism to solve the human problems. Socialism is an effect to get you to the point where you can face the human problems. And I think the kind of thing you're concerned about is a human problem. And those are going to be there. Humans are very complicated creatures and have lots of ways of torturing themselves in their interpersonal relations. Everybody knows that without soap operas. Right? I put in my notes here. Socialism is not enough. It is not a complete social economic solution. More is needed. The next step is anarchism. But anarchism is only the next step. It is also not a complete solution, right? And anarchism argues exactly. Anarchism is basically like, okay, the bare minimum is socialism. That's the bare minimum, but you can't stop there. You can't stop with, okay, the working class has ownership of their means of production. We win. Like, that's it. It's like, no, okay, now we have risen from animals to the rest of the animals to, like, we're now human beings. Like, we're now not in dehumanizing conditions. Okay, now, but we need to go further than that, right? Which, Chomsky argues is like that's one of the problems, right? You end with this incomplete understanding of what it means to be a human being, socialism, and you don't go further. So what is anarchism? Anarchism is just an acknowledgement that, okay, we need to take it to the next level, right? The way society works now, it's not working, right? We need to be developing, and we need to be constantly developing, our politics and our socioeconomic ways of doing things to escape dehumanizing conditions, right? And be better human beings. This is the fifth of the last line of the page, right? Anarchy as a social philosophy has never meant chaos, quotes. In fact, anarchists have typically believed in a highly organized society, just one that's organized democratically from below. Bottom up, not top down, right? Okay, now we're at the bottom of page 31. This is the last paragraph. In order to work hard for social change, you need to be able to spell out a plan for a future society in any kind of detail. What I feel should drive a person to work for change are certain principles you'd like to see achieved. Now, you may not know in detail, and I don't think that any of us do know in detail, how those principles can best be realized at this point in complex systems like human societies. But I don't really see why that should make any difference. What you try to do is advance the principles, right? So Chomsky is arguing, like, the common responses. Well, how can anarchism be implemented? Like, how do you implement a society where there is a non-hierarchical chain of command, right? Where there is no chain of command, right? How does that work? And then, there's a pause. It is like, well, we can spend some time thinking about it. And then the response is, well, we don't have time for that, right? We have a system already in place. It's functioning. Basically the argument against anarchism is like, well, there's already a system that exists. Why should we implement another system that you don't necessarily have detailed explanation on how it should work? It's like, and Chomsky's argument is like, yeah, because the current system we have in place doesn't acknowledge principles that are important to us. Well, what kind of principles? It's like, well, what about the right for every person to be a human being, right? The ability for certain people to not be in dehumanizing positions. What does that mean? It's like, well, maybe not go bankrupt trying to have access to necessary healthcare, right? Maybe not avoid being educated because you just can't afford it, right? These are dehumanizing conditions, by the way. Going hungry for days because you don't have enough food to eat, living in a food desert where the only food that's accessible are like Lay's potato chips and gummy worms and maybe alcohol, right? I'm talking about the liquor stores. When you grow up in the ghettos and the hoods, this is what it is, right? And these are dehumanizing conditions, like principles like that, right? They need to work. Okay, so this is page 32. This is the 11th to last line. Since we're dealing with complex systems which nobody understands very much, the sensible move, I think, is to make changes and then see what happens. And if they work, make further changes. That's true across the board, actually. So I don't feel in a position, and even if I felt I was, I wouldn't say it, to know what the long-term results are going to look like in any kind of detail. Those are things that will have to be discovered, in my view. Instead, the basic principle I would like to see communicated to people is the idea that every form of authority and domination and hierarchy, every authoritarian structure has to be proved that it's justified. It has no prior justification, right? So by default, because currently we accept by default like, well, there's got to be people in power. Like there's got to be like a president. There's got to be some sort of commander in chief. There's got to be like some CEO, and that Chomsky is arguing like, why does there have to be that? And if your answer is because it is so, right? Like Chomsky is like, well, that's not good enough. You gotta like give me an explanation as to why these authority figures exist. And are they actually like doing positive things? Like, because if they're not, then they need to be going away. Like these figures of power are not allocated by God, right? That we don't have to have them exist necessarily, right? They should be explaining why they're necessary. And if they can't do that, if they're just like, well, that's just the way it is, then that's a problem, right? That's unscientific, as Chomsky would say, right? And I would say that too. I like that analogy, the science analogy. So this is page 33. This is the 5th line. I don't really understand anarchism as being much more than that. As far as I can see, it's just the point of view that says that people have the right to be free. And if there are constraints on that freedom, then you've got to justify them. Sometimes you can, but of course anarchism or anything else doesn't give you the answers about when that is. You just have to look at the specific cases. For example, sometimes you can justify like, okay, certain freedoms have to be taken away. And okay, why? An example would be like when I walk my doggy. I have a dog and I give him a walk. And I have a leash on him so he doesn't go running around, because he might run into the street and get hit by a car, which I've definitely prevented him from doing that many, many times. He also is aggressive, so he might like charge at somebody and try to bite him. He's not good with strangers. And so I don't want like a random stranger to be bitten by my dog. That would be horrible. So I restrict that freedom from him. That's justifiable, and a reasonable person to say like, okay, that makes sense. It's good to have a leash. He can't have that freedom, but he's still loving. We let him in the house. We give him treats. We pet him all the time. We're not treating him horribly. He can't do certain things. And that's just one example. A very famous example is a child runs into the street. You run, right when the car's about to hit him, the parent comes, runs, grabs him away, so he saves the child from the car getting hit by a car. It's like you've taken away the child's freedom at that moment, but now the child's alive. I mean, these are things you could explain. Many people in power, or when limits of freedom are put in place, they can't be logically explained, or they can only be logically explained in the sense that, you're just empowering certain people at the expense of taking other people's freedoms away. When you look at it that way, it makes perfect sense, which is not a moral explanation, right? Right? Not really an acceptable response in terms of the interests of the public. And so for Chomsky, this is what anarchism is at its fundamental level. And so what do you do? Well, it depends on the situation. There is no one answer. And this is page 35, third to last line. That's one of the main purposes of socialism, I think. To reach a point where people have the opportunity to decide freely for themselves what their needs are, and not just have the choices forced on them by some arbitrary system of power. And of course, we currently don't have that at all, right? I mean, it's depending on the country. Some countries, you really don't have that. The United States, you sort of kind of have that, but not necessarily. There are systems in power that are actively saying, you need to do this, and you literally do not have the freedom to do these kinds of things. Like, of course, transgender rights, or all these laws that are against the freedom to identify or to realize LGBTQIA plus ways of being, right? Currently here where I live, even going back, we're starting to go back old school days of what it means to be a woman. And it's like, women who are like, hey, I don't really want to have children. And it's like, what the government's like, well, tough patootie. Like, that's who you are. You're a woman and you have children. That's what women do. And it's like, wait a minute, I need freedom to do something else. Maybe I don't want that, but it's more and more, banning of books and things of that nature. And so Chomsky's all against that. I too see anarchism as a way to fight that kind of imposed definition and imposed restriction of freedom that is illegitimate and unjustifiable. Let me read you this quote. This quote I'm about to read you is why many anarchists kind of distance themselves from Chomsky because they're like, oh, he's capitulating to neoliberal thinking, right? But I don't know, I think it's kind of practical, and you're thinking in the real world. You have to like frame your thinking in the real world, right? So listen to this, right? This is page 40. This is the second paragraph, 7th line. The immediate goal of even committed anarchists should be to defend some state institutions, while helping to pry them open to more meaningful public participation, and ultimately to dismantle them in a much more free society. There are practical problems of tomorrow on which people's lives very much depend, and while defending these kinds of programs is by no means the ultimate end we should be pursuing, in my view, we still have to face the problems that are right on the horizon and which seriously affect human lives. I don't think those things can simply be forgotten because they might not fit within some radical slogan that reflects a deeper vision of a future society. So, you know, he's talking about like, hey, everybody should still vote. They should still vote, you know. Some anarchists would be like, no, voting is, when you vote, you're just reiterating the oppressive systems in place. And, you know, Chomsky would be like, well, it's, you know, this is the world we live in today. Of course, we should fight for that, for the current representative democracy that doesn't work in our favor. We should fight to end that. But currently, like, we should participate in the ways that we can, right? Working toward better ways of doing things. You know, the example of that recently is our last presidential election, right? We had the former Vice President Kamala Harris against like the now President Donald Trump. And there was, you know, several people that I know was like, they're the two sides of the same coin. I'm not even gonna vote. You know, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter. They're all corrupt. Kamala Harris is just as evil and fucked up as Donald Trump, which I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. You see the state of things now, and I don't think it would be as fucked up as it is if Kamala Harris, but I mean, that's just my assessment. And I think Chomsky is like getting to that point. It's like, look, you can't detach yourself from reality just because it doesn't fit your idealism, right? You have to live in the mud, do what you can, and then work toward getting something better. You know, we would have had one person who's president who would not blatantly say that climate change is a hoax and it's like not actually happening, and that fossil fuels are the things that are making climate disasters more extreme and make them happening more often. One person would have admitted that and would have at least you know, put some systems in place to kind of reconcile that. They probably wouldn't have been perfect by no means, but there would be some systems in place, right? Or some initiatives that we could kind of work toward or kind of push in like better directions, but we don't even have that. I mean, we clearly have a person who completely denies the climate crisis, even though like we are on a regular basis having people getting killed for these extreme climate situations, and we're doing nothing about it except we're just making it worse and worse, right? That kind of thing, right? But I'll continue. The deeper visions should be maintained. They're important, but dismantling the state system is a goal that's a lot farther away. And you want to deal first with what's at hand and nearby. I think, and in any realistic perspective, the political system, with all its flaws, does have opportunities for participation by the general population, which other existing institutions, such as corporations, don't have. And then he continues on page 41. This is the second to the last line of the second paragraph. These are questions which really can't be discussed in isolation from the society as it actually exists. So I think that it's completely realistic and rational to work within structures to which you are opposed, because by doing so you can help to move it to a situation where then you can challenge those structures. Sounds logical. Let's continue. Page 42, the end of the 6th line. In particular circumstances, you sometimes have to accept and use illegitimate structures, corporations. There is nothing in the society right now that can protect people from the tyranny except the federal government. Now, it doesn't protect them very well because mostly it's run by the corporations, but still it does have some limited effect. It can enforce regulatory measures under public pressure, let's say. It can reduce dangerous toxic waste disposal. It can set minimum standards on healthcare and so on. In fact, it has various things that it can do to improve the situation. That's actually my day job. I work in the safety department of a company that owns an airline, right? And of course, like if you own an airline, there's laws that you have to follow to ensure safety of employees, right? And I'm like one of those people who make sure those laws are followed. I mean, it's not a perfect system, but oftentimes I do have to step in and say like, okay, y'all need to stop doing this because if y'all continue to do this, you're literally breaking the law. And that's really the deterrent, rather than like, not only are they breaking law, they're actually putting people's lives in danger, right? But sometimes, breaking the law and getting fined, like heavily fined, is more of a motivating factor than like ensuring the safety of people, right? And that's what Chomsky is talking about. It's like, look, there is some usage in this imperfect system, but once you get into the imperfect system, then you push further, but you have to start somewhere, right? Let's just get rid of the federal government as soon as we possibly can, right? That's what some anarchists would say. And then let the private tyrannies take over everything. I mean, for an anarchist to advocate that is just outlandish, in my opinion. So I really don't see any contradiction at all here. What happens is that an authoritarian government or a dictatorship gets toppled, and a vacuum gets created, right? And then what happens is some tyrants come in and like, I'll just take the power, right? Because there's no system in place, no regulatory situation going on, right? And then the same thing just happens, sometimes even worse, right? It's just an acknowledgement that look, the world is it's a pretty muddy, fucked up place, and not the most ideal options are going to be available all the time, right? And that's important to understand. A willingness to face some of the complexities of life for what they are, and the complexities of life include the fact that there are a lot of ugly things out there. And if you care about the fact that some kid in downtown Boston is starving, or that some poor person can't get adequate medical care, or that somebody's going to pour toxic waste in your backyard, or anything at all like that, well, then you try to stop it. And there's only one institution around right now that can stop it, like OSHA or something like that, right? If you just want to be pure and say, I'm against power, period. Well, okay, say, I'm against the federal government. But that's just to divorce yourself from any human concerns, in my view. And I don't think that's a reasonable stance for anarchists or anybody else to take. Yeah, so when I was reading this, I'm like, oh, okay, this is why some of these really hardcore anarchists, they diverge away from Chomsky, because I'm in a lot of community activist circles, and some self-identified anarchists will tell me like, yeah, I don't like Chomsky. He's a bit too leftist for me. He's kind of centrist, and I ask him how so. Well, he just kind of bends to the will of the government sometimes, and I'm like, oh, okay. Then I read this and I'm like, oh, I see, because a lot of these, some of these anarchists that I know, they're just trying to like burn it all down, and they're not trying to do anything else but just burn it all down. It's like, okay, but there needs to be some follow-up to that, right? Let me bring up here like a history lesson. And I think it's important to talk about this because we're talking about that concept of wage slavery. So check this out. This is another interview. This is page 107 at the top. And Chomsky's words here. The United States is sort of out of the world on this topic. Here, the term libertarian means the opposite of what it always meant in history. Libertarian throughout modern European history meant socialist anarchist. It meant the anti-state element of the workers' movement and the socialist movement. Here, it means ultra-conservative, like Ayn Rand or Cato Institution or something like that. But that's a special US usage. There are a lot of things quite special about the way the United States developed. And this is part of it. In Europe, it meant, and always meant to me, an anti-state branch of socialism, which meant a highly organized society, nothing to do with chaos, but based on democracy all the way through. That means democratic control of communities, of workplaces, of federal structures, built on systems of voluntary association, spreading internationally. That's traditional anarchism. You know, anybody can have the word if they like, but that's the mainstream of traditional anarchism. And it has roots. Coming back to the United States, it has very strong roots in the American working class movement. The 1850s, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And this is page 108, end of the 5th line of the 2nd paragraph. Independent newspapers that arose spontaneously without any background. The writers had never heard of Marx or Bakunin or anyone else, yet they developed the same ideas. From their point of view, what they called wage slavery, renting yourself to an owner, was not very different from chattel slavery that they were fighting a civil war about. So the idea of renting yourself, meaning working for wages, was degrading. It was an attack on your personal integrity. They despised the industrial system that was developing. That was destroying their culture, destroying their independence, their individuality, constraining them to be subordinate to masters. There was a tradition of what was called republicanism in the United States. This was the core of the labor movement all over. Okay, well, it gets a little deeper here. Page 109, 2nd paragraph. That was a strong, rich American culture, which was crushed by violence. The United States has a very violent labor history, much more so than Europe. It was wiped out over a long period with extreme violence. By the time it picked up again in the 1930s, that's when I personally came into the tail end of it. After the Second World War, it was crushed. By now, it's forgotten. But it's very real. I don't really think it's forgotten. I think it's just below the surface in people's consciousness. You know, and he's talking about, like, yeah, this idea of wage slavery. And, you know, the idea, like, you know, you bring that up. Working for a corporation, you're just a slave. Of course, like, the common response to that today is like, well, don't compare yourself to a slave. Like, a slave, you know, during that time in American history, that was way, way more oppressive, more restrictive, more different than working for a corporation, right? And of course, in many ways it is, right, today. In many ways it is, you know. But what Chomsky is saying is, like, back then, like, there was a comparison made, you know, back during Civil War era, there was kind of an equivalency that was going on. And that was part of the zeitgeist. That was a popular opinion at that time. And a lot of that was fueled by, like, anarchist thinking. Right, so we're just trying to give you a history of, like, the background of it, but that's kind of been lost because, like, capitalism has been normalized in our society. Working for a corporation for, like, long hours and you're, like, tired as fuck afterward, that's kind of like the norm now. But it didn't used to be the norm. Like, it was actually considered kind of equivalent to, like, being a slave. Okay, 4th paragraph of page 109, 6th line. When you bring up the idea that you have to rent yourself to somebody and follow their orders and that they own and you work, you built it, but you don't own it, that's a highly unnatural notion. You don't have to study any complicated theories to see that this is an attack on human dignity. Right? If you really think about it, like, yeah, I mean, it kind of sucks, right? And of course, like, it sucks, but we just accept the fact that it sucks. You know, most people, or yeah, I would say most people go to a job they don't like to just get a paycheck. You know, they give up their time, their work, just to, like, get a means to survive, right? Pretty lousy ass way of being, right? But we just kind of accept it. We're like, yeah, I mean, that's just life. I mean, it is what it is. I live for the weekend or whatever. I live for my few days off. But Chomsky is like, you know, we don't really acknowledge today, like, how unnatural that notion is and how, like, dehumanizing and how undignified that truly is. Like, we just kind of accept that as normal now, which is pretty absurd. This is the top of page 110. The core of anarchist tradition, as I understand it, is that power is always illegitimate, unless it proves itself to be legitimate. So the burden of proof is always on those who claim that some authoritarian hierarchic relation is legitimate. If they can't prove it, then it should be dismantled. Right, we go back to that. Okay, but we're gonna skip down several lines. Second paragraph, fifth to the last line. It's not the responsibility of anyone else to show that it's illegitimate. It's illegitimate by assumption. If it's a relation of authority among human beings which places some above others. Unless you can give a strong argument to show that it's right, you've lost. Right? And so again, like, this is what anarchism is to Chomsky. You look at somebody who has power over you and it's like, why? Right? You don't just accept it. It's like, well, you know, he's the boss. That's the boss. It's like, well, should he be the boss? Like, why is he the boss? What makes him the boss? What rationale is there that this person is the boss or the manager or the person in command? Like, and if that can't be explained adequately, then that person shouldn't be the boss anymore. But like, that's not how society works now. We just accept people in charge now. It's just like, oh, you know, he's a guy and he sucks, but it is what it is. That's who we have. Okay, this is page 113, second line. To do things alone is extremely hard, especially when you're working 50 hours a week to put the food on the table. Join with others and you can do a lot of things. It's got a big multiplier effect. That's why unions have always been in the lead of development of social and economic progress. They bring together poor people, working people, enable them to learn from one another, to have their own sources of information, and to act collectively. That's how everything is changed. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the solidarity movement, the workers' movement. The reason we don't live in a dungeon is because people have joined together to change things. And there's nothing different now from before. That's how we make the change. We're like, man, the world's fucked up today. How do we make it better? We gotta team up. We gotta join forces. United we stand, divided we fall. Old adage, but it's true. That's how everything gets accomplished. You know, that's how society becomes better. One person doesn't do it. It's a team of people. It's a huge collective. It's community. Chomsky continues here. Go back to 1962. All of the things that we take for granted just weren't there. How did they get there? Was it a gift from an angel? No, they got there by struggle, common struggle, by people who dedicated themselves with others, because you can't do it alone. And their efforts made it a much more civilized country. It was a long way to go. And that's not the first time it happened, and it will continue, right? That's how we deal with climate change and social inequality and like the tragedy of inaccessible healthcare and like the exorbitant price of education. We gotta team up and be like, enough is enough. But you can't do it alone. We gotta be like the working class, the proletariat, but more so like the community, the people in community, not just unified by the fact that we're laborers and we create the stuff that capitalists use, but also the fact that we're all human beings and we all want certain things, basic necessities, not just food, water, and shelter. I mean, we do need those things. They're very important, but also belonging, love, self-esteem, all those Maslow hierarchy of needs stuff, right? We need all those things so we can come together in that way. And you look at the past, you know, people will argue with me and they'll say like, oh, you know, you don't really, it's just the same as it was in the 60s. Racism still exists as it was. It's like, well, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I read so much, because I know back in the day, there was a time in America where it was illegal for people like me, black people, to read. It literally was against the law. And that's not the case anymore. Like, I can like communicate with people from around the world. That's great, you know, through the internet and such. I have free time, you know, I can do things I have leisure, you know, the world has become better for me because of the struggles of other people in the past. It is not the same. It has improved, right? The pendulum is kind of swinging the other way, the opposite direction as progress, but we can bring it back. We can. But we gotta do it together. Okay, this is page 140, the second paragraph. A vision of a future social order is in turn based on a concept of human nature. If in fact man is an indefinitely malleable, completely plastic being with no innate structures of mind and no intrinsic needs of a cultural or social character, then he is a fit subject for the shaping of behavior by the state authority, the corporate manager, the technocrat, or the central committee. Those with some confidence in the human species will hope this is not so, and will try to determine the intrinsic human characteristics that provide the framework for intellectual development, the growth of moral consciousness, cultural achievement, and participation in a free community. Okay, this is page 142, the seventh to last line. Social action cannot await a firmly established theory of man and society, nor can the validity of the latter be determined by our hopes and moral judgments. The two, speculation and action, must progress as best they can, looking forward to the day when theoretical inquiry will provide a firm guide to the unending, often grim, but never hopeless struggle for freedom and social justice. Yeah, so, Chomsky's saying like, hey, anarchism, it's just about just going out and just doing shit, right? Just start doing stuff that works, man, but do it in community. Say like, hey, we don't have a grocery store that we could drive to. It's too far away. We need to like set up a community pantry. Let's do it. We don't have to get government funding for that. We can set it up ourselves. Man, my school system is banning books about race and like queer and LGBTQIA plus issues. Like, well, I mean, we can just make a book club and just read those banned books with our kids on our own. Fortunately, that's still a thing we could do in the United States of America before they take that away. And then we could just have a little society for ourselves where we're just talking about that, parents, mentors, the youth together, just doing it on our own. Man, the internet sucks, right? The lack of information is horrible. It's all about pushing products. There's no content that's like rigorous anymore, like intellectually invigorating, or like stimulation of the mind that's like encourages people to gain more wisdom. It's just like selling products and memes and shit. Well, you know what? We got YouTube. Why don't we just make a channel and we can just do stuff like this? I can just make my own channel where I talk about books, and whoever watches it, they'll watch it, and I'll push it to my friends and family and people that I'm talking to about these ideas, and I'll give the link to them, and I'll just have it free and accessible on the internet. Sure, the algorithm's gonna fuck it up, and it's gonna be pushed on the sidelines, and maybe not so many people are gonna see it. And maybe if I accepted some sponsorship and I didn't talk about anarchism, and I just talked about like capitalism and became a capitalist diehard, maybe I can sell, like I get a sponsorship from some corporation and they can push my video and get like much more views. But fuck that, I don't want to do that. I just want to do my own thing. And if the right people see it, the right people see it. If one person sees it, that's fine, And if enough of us keep doing this shit, cool information will begin to perpetuate throughout the internet, right? And a lot of us are doing it. A lot of us are like forming informative videos. I'm just one of many. We out here, and we just need to form communities and combine forces. There's a lot of us willing to make a change in society, but we don't have to rely on these illegitimate power structures to make it happen. We can do it on our own together. And that's really what anarchism is, right? Or that's what anarchism proposes, right? But I guess anarchism is the proposition, right? That's what it is. But anyway, I would encourage you, like, hey, if you're new to Chomsky, you're like, I don't really know much about Chomsky. This is actually a good starting point in terms of his political philosophy. He actually does dive into some of his language philosophy too in this too. If you're like a little curious about his philosophy in language, he dives into that a little bit in this book. Not like super much, it's mostly just politics, but there's some philosophy of linguistics in here too. I think this is a good introduction to Chomsky. Then you can read this and you can be like, okay, I like Chomsky are like, I don't know about this guy. I think this is a little good intro, a good primer. So check it out. Well, you've been watching The Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.